Today on Keynote.
I truly believe results move at the speed of relationships, and the more durable relationships you can build, the better off you're going to be.
Even in an interim role, that's critical for you.
That is the difference to me between success and failure.
My name is Bill Russell. I'm a former CIO for a 16-hospital system and creator of This Week Health, where we are dedicated to transforming healthcare one connection at a time. Our Keynote show is designed to share conference-level value with you every week. Now, let's jump right into the episode.
All right, it's Keynote, and today we're joined by Christopher Scanzera, who's going to be our interim expert. He just finished an opportunity to be interim at Lurie Children's. He's been a consultant with the big, what do we call them now, Chris? Big three, big four, big...
Still big four.
Big four, okay. You just never know when it's just going to get whittled down a little bit further. Also, a former CEO, our CIO at major health system out of New Jersey as well. And we have Judy Kirby, CEO with Kirby and Associates, Kirby Partners. I'm sorry. I leave the mistakes in so people know that it's 6 o'clock in the morning and I am not running on all cylinders yet. Judy, welcome. And Chris, welcome to the show. Look forward to the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about interim leadership roles and interim opportunities in the interim landscape as it exists today. I just noted in an article I wrote yesterday that we are what I'm calling the great CIO musical chairs is going on. The stat I was working off of was from one of your competitors, Judy. It was Kiefer did a survey and they found 53% of all sitting healthcare CIOs have only been in the role for the last 3 years. So there's been a significant shift at the CIO role over the last 3 years. And that obviously is one of the primary drivers for the interim landscape. I'm curious, Judy, give us an idea. What trends are you seeing in interim healthcare leadership demands and what's going on in the marketplace in this area?
I think it's increasing, as you mentioned, with the turnover. But I also think organizations are looking, do we have the right person in the chair? And the interim role depends a lot on how much timing there was between the time the person announced they were leaving versus left very quickly. Is there somebody internally that they can put in that interim role, either as a stopgap measure or someone that they think possibly could be promoted to that role, but they want to give them the opportunity to try? So I think there's a lot going on out there right now, and especially with mergers, acquisitions, you're seeing a lot of individuals back on the marketplace because of that as well, looking for other opportunities. And a lot of times they'll say, hey, I'll do some interim work in between positions.
We're going to talk about that internal interim because we do these 229 roundtables. And when I ask the question about succession planning and have you prepared the next generation, I get too many blank stares. I don't get enough like, yes, this is an intentional thing that I'm doing as a CIO. I mean, do you have that same experience, or is there generally one or two people that could easily step into those roles?
I'm getting a lot of, there's no one here that can take over. And the question is why? And again, succession planning almost always has to be an organizational thing to work successfully. It can't just be the technology department to a certain extent. It can, but it works better when there's buy-in from the whole organization that this is what we need to do.
We're going to bounce back and forth. So Judy, I'm going to come to you to give us an idea of what's going on and what you're hearing from the search side, what people are coming to you and asking for. And then Chris, I'm going to just bounce back over to you and talk about your experience as an interim. What's interesting, when you step into that interim role, that first 90 days, I mean, it's a short-term gig. Does that influence your first 90 days and how you're thinking about what you're going to do in that role? How do you determine what you're going to do in that role? I mean, you're not taking over the reins permanently. You're taking it over for a period of time.
This is true. And you have to hit the ground running. And you kind of have to come in with not a preconceived notion of what it is, but a preconceived notion of what you're going to do. You kind of come in with your roadmap of what's going to happen in the first 2 weeks, and then the next 2 weeks, and then the next 2 weeks after that. You have to come in with a structured approach, a framework, a mindset, a thought of listening and learning and assimilating very rapidly, because the big difference is, whereas if you take on a permanent role and you have a protracted honeymoon period, you may have a month or two, you really only have a couple of weeks to get going very quickly in the interim role. And I think part of the big difference is, at least with the successful interims, is the ability to hit the ground running and do that well and do that very quickly.
How do you determine what their expectations are? When you go into some of these, it's like, hey, we expect you to turn some things around. Some people might, their expectation might be, hey, just keep the seat warm, make sure we don't get hacked during this time. Or another might just be, hey, make sure the team stops leaving. I understand everybody's interviewing and getting ready to abandon ship. Are there certain things that they all sort of have in common and other things that you have to get a read from the leadership?
There are, and I can honestly say that the process starts at the interview process. And as you're going through, generally it's multiple interviews at the client, and you're taking notes and you're learning to kind of get a sense of what the real scope is going to be. Is this an engagement where you're going in and you're just keeping the trains running on time and you're doing transformation as required? Or is this a situation where they really want you to come in and they really want you to make aggressive changes, not necessarily blow up the organization, but really make significant transformational readiness to get the organization set up for the next leader that's coming in? So one way or the other, it's usually one or the other, or typically maybe something right in the middle of that. And then how do you go about it? It's you start with a lot of interviews. And again, it's results moving at the speed of relationships. You build the relationships. You have to get yourself grounded in the C-suite very early on and build those relationships. And then you have to do it with the IT team to understand what's important to them and then develop the scope, because it's not always fully vetted when you start the engagement. It generally comes in the first couple of weeks to figure out, where do we really need to go with this?
I think the other thing, a lot of organizations, especially now, are not sure what they need in their next technology leader. Where are they going with digital? Where are they going with AI? Where are they going with the cloud? And I think sometimes having that interim come in and give them an independent assessment. As we know, when consultants come in, they listen to them more than they listen to the current CIO, even if they're telling them the exact same thing. So I think sometimes that interim can really help sort of level set for where they need to be going in the future.
The expert from afar has been something I've seen in my career since the get-go. And sometimes it's worked for me, sometimes it's worked against me. Judy, I'm curious, when somebody comes to you and they're looking for an interim leader versus a permanent leader, are there different qualities that you might look for an interim candidate versus a permanent candidate?
Oh, absolutely. I think somebody who has a consulting background like Chris does, somebody who's done interim work, is going to be a little more successful because they've got a better playbook coming in. But again, I think it's what the organization says they want versus what they end up hiring for
How do,
both the
how do,
interim
how
and
do
the
you, I've always wondered that about your role. Your role is tough because what I've found in conversations with people, not CIOs, but others within, I'll ask them, what are your expectations of the IT organization? And they're like all over the place. And I'm like, okay, so how do you know who to hire? It sounds like you don't know whether you want an electrician or a carpenter or an architect or you don't really know what you want out of IT. And now you're going to go hire somebody to lead it, or are you just looking for them to tell you what you need in IT? That process fascinates me, and it's probably one of the harder parts of your job, I would imagine.
what is it? Harvard Business School said when you have more than 7 opinions, you can't get consensus. And if you look at some of the large interviewing teams and teams of stakeholders setting what they want, sometimes it's very difficult to get consensus on what they need going forward. And again, it's trying to bring them together to discuss what are going to be the most important things in this new leader or the interim.
To build on Judy's point for a second, you talk about the consulting background, which has helped me a ton. In terms of the qualities of an interim versus the permanent, fast situational assessment, you got to be able to get in there and size things up very quickly. And you're going into an uncertain situation. So you really have to be able to deal with ambiguous situations very well. You have to have a high tolerance for that. Political acumen, again, you're walking into an organization typically where maybe somebody was loved as a CIO and departed, or maybe not. So you have to understand the political temperatures of not just the C-suite, but also of the IT executive team. And then there's a hope that on the part of the C-suite, to your point, what do they need to be taught or what do they need to learn as part of the process? So you kind of have to have some depth in multiple technical areas, and you have to be able to communicate at multiple levels effectively. So you're not going to communicate the same way with the IT staff as you are with the C-suite. So I think when you tap on all of those things, Bill, to answer the question a little bit more broadly and deeply, you really have to be able to reach into your toolkit and hit on each of those things to kind of bring a successful engagement to the client.
Do you have to be more technical as an interim versus a full-time?
I think so. I think because you're going to get hit with a lot of different questions in a lot of different domains, that one afternoon you may have to put a CTO type of hat on, or one afternoon you may have to put your VP of apps hat on, or you may be in the throes of a potential cyber challenge. So you may have to put your risk and regulatory hat on. So you really need to be able to go across the entire waterfront and then occasionally a little bit deeper than you might expect into some of those domains.
So it's just outright out to consider somebody from outside the industry for an interim role. Like, not enough time to come up to speed.
I get asked that once in a while. And I think in some instances, you can learn from the outside industries because sometimes, provider IT is a little bit of a laggard. But in the interim roles, I never suggest it. You just can't.
I agree with that. And a lot of times they'll want somebody that has the Epic background or the Cerner background, or even going into that level for the interim.
Is the interview process as I want to use the word arduous, and I'm not sure that's the right word. Although the interviews I've gone through for CIO roles, some of them have been almost downright silly. The number of people you have to talk to and the groups you have to meet with, and they take a long time, and sometimes they take a really extended period of time. I assume the interim interviews are much more truncated and fewer people. Is that accurate, Judy?
That is accurate, but they're still arduous. And again, they're trying to build consensus, making sure that the individual that they're bringing in is going to be successful there. Some of them even have some of the IT leadership team interviewing the individual as well. So again, it depends on the organization. Some are 2 or 3 people make the decision. Others, it's almost the entire slate that will interview the final candidate.
You've used the word build consensus a couple times. I mean, what's the best way for them to build consensus? Is it in the interview process, or is there a different way that they can build consensus?
I think consensus comes with understanding expectations and making sure those are aligned. If you don't have aligned expectations, it's really hard to build consensus. So I think understanding what they're trying to accomplish with the interim, as well as what are they trying to accomplish long-term for their technology department.
Yeah, I heard a CIO recently say to me, he got tired of this AI thing. And so he actually gathered all the leaders into a room and he did a full day session to get to their AI ambition. This was the metric he was trying to get to. What is our AI ambition as an organization? As you imagine, it's all over the board. It's like, what are our AI ambitions? And some people wanted them to be cutting edge, new stuff. Other people were like, no, let everybody go first. We'll be last, whatever. That's where they started. And you can imagine when you have that kind of broad spectrum, there's no way to be successful. I mean, and that's what he was feeling. It's like, there's no way for me to be successful leading this effort if your expectations are all the way over here and all the way over here. There's just no way to do that. So how do you bring those things in line pretty quickly? Chris, I'm going to go to you for this question, because when you come into the role, is there something you can do to quickly build consensus across the leadership and the staff?
This is part of the walking tour early on to find out where everybody is, right? Because you're going to get multiple opinions and multiple wishes, desires, and interests in terms of directionally where you want to go. And what we need to do is out of the gate talk about it not being an IT issue per se, that it's an enterprise issue. And a lot of times the directive doesn't necessarily need to come from IT. And I've seen greater success going to the outside and bringing somebody from the outside in to talk about policy, process, procedure, organizing it, and then starting to get the program set in place that way. So what it does is it kind of levels the playing field a little bit.
Judy, I want to come back to you on this internal interim thing, because we talked about expert from afar. Are internal candidates, do they have a leg up, or do they potentially have a strike against them because they're already there, or does it depend on the situation?
I think it depends on the situation and how their boss was viewed on the way out. Are they going to carry on what was being done, and is that positive or is it a negative? So I think a lot of times organizations, even with an interim, will go outside and look at other candidates. Sometimes they won't, and they'll give that person a chance. So I think it's all over the place. But I had a conversation with one person who was an interim, And he said, well, I'm just going to wait and see what happens. And I said, no, you need to take this job and own it and treat it like it's your own. He did that. They didn't interview any other candidates. They just promoted him. So I think a lot of times it just depends on the organization, but I think they have to trust that they are ready for the job and they can do the job and take it over if they're the interim.
That's some of the coaching I give to people when they get those kinds of roles. It's like, if you want that role, treat it like it's your first day on the job and just run with it. The worst case scenario is they decide that you're not a fit. The best case scenario is they just say, you know what, the inertia of this is just easier. You're doing a good job. It's my story. It's like, I'm there for 6 months and they're doing a national search and they're like, it would just be better if you just kept doing what you're doing. And I'm like, okay. Well, and never underestimate the power of inertia in a large organization.
The power of being there. And again, normally the internal is more cost effective simply because they've been there for a while. You're not hiring from the outside. So a lot of organizations, especially those that are in sort of a cash crunch right now, and especially those who aren't looking for somebody who's already been there as far as the digital or the cloud with unquote 10 years of experience in those areas, internal may be their best bet for that.
Bill, one of the things you and I spoke about, I guess it was a while ago, on this very topic is we talk about the sitting CIO and the interim CIO, and the whole notion that while the interim CIO is that entitled, when you're the interim CIO, the role and the responsibility is you are the de facto CIO. And the role, the responsibility, the fiduciary duty, the responsibility to the organization is all the same. So you get up every morning, you go in, you give it 110%. It doesn't matter. The job is still the job, whether it's interim or not.
One of the things that would be different for me if I was an interim, I believe, and then Chris, I'd love for you to just talk about what would be different in those two roles. Maybe not the approach, maybe there is a time element to it that you want to handle quickly. But one of the things for me is if I'm interim, I want to stem the bleeding as quickly as possible. I want to make sure that key staff members don't leave and all that. That's a very important thing for me as an interim because I want to promote stability because it isn't necessarily my role. I'm preparing it for somebody else. And so I want to stabilize it as quickly as possible. And since I'm not going to be a CIO anymore, I can actually say this out loud. When I become a permanent, I'm really okay with as many people leaving as possible because it gives me an opportunity to bring my own team in and I don't have to fire anybody. You run the risk of some key person leaving, but I also have a lot of confidence in my ability to find somebody else that could do the job probably better than the person who left. If you're coming in as an interim, there's typically an event that preceded it, right? Somebody left either abruptly or not abruptly. They just need time to do things. The most they want steady state is somebody left who they like. They just need some time to find somebody. So they want somebody to sort of keep the chair warm, make sure things keep running and that kind of stuff while they do a proper search.
Right.
But in my experience, that's like a third. And then 2/3 are some other story, either the published story or the unpublished story of what actually happened before you got there. So that's one of the things I find different in my approach. And since I'm not going to be an interim or full-time, I can actually say that out loud. But Chris, what do you find maybe a little different in your approach as interim versus full-time?
I think on the way in the door, I think the biggest thing you have to go after first is building that trust. To your point, there was an event or something occurred at the front end of it, and you have a somewhat fragmented situation for one reason or another. And there's an element of trust that has to be rebuilt. You have to go down the path of learning that and respecting the institutional knowledge of which you have no idea about. So it's, again, working with the people, you're being transparent and authentic about everything because you don't want to get caught up in a trap where people are perceiving you as anything but that. You want to make those early decisions where you can and try to find those wins. You want to be open and available around communication. You want to be accessible. And for those wins that you can get early, you want to share the credibility and the credit generously. So I think that's in terms of what's really different. That may not be something that you have to do in record time as an inbound permanent CIO, but as coming in as an interim, I think you absolutely need to do that. And then that's at the IT executive level and then the IT staff level. Within the C-suite and the board, again, similar versions, variation on a theme, clear communication, structured and relevant updates, bring them close, understand them, build the relationships. Many times people that know me have heard me say that I truly believe results move at the speed of relationships, and the more durable relationships you can build them and the faster you can, the much better off you're going to be.
Even in an interim role, that's critical for you.
100%. That is the difference to me between success and failure.
All right. I've been doing something recently called the escape room. So I've been doing escape rooms with people. I'm going to give you both an escape room scenario for your role. I've been doing the healthcare CIO escape room, mostly because a lot of CIOs have been giving me some pat answers recently. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to put you in an impossible situation and see how you respond to it. Insubordination. So you go in as interim and your VP of infrastructure and applications is telling his team, yeah, you don't need to listen to this guy. He's only interim. He's not going to be around anyway. We have our plan. We're just going to keep executing it. We're just going to keep going in this direction. So that's your escape room. How do you handle that one?
To me, that's one of those issues that you take head on with the person. You can't avoid it. And then it's a conversation where you have to try to get to the root of that. And you kind of have to lay out why they're communicating that. While that may be true, there are certain things that we're going to have to do together. And that's one of those where you don't have to necessarily fight the battle alone, because there's a human capital organization within the overall enterprise that you can tap in for help also. But I do believe that's something you just have to take head on with them and get to the root of it and help them try to understand we want to win together. And yeah, maybe we can do this with your suggested approach, but we don't want to advertise it as, well, don't pay attention to him, because it's a lack of respect, and respect runs both ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. By the way, that's a very real scenario because that's happened to me.
And me as well.
Yeah, it's maybe it's more common than I thought it was. Judy, we already touched on this one, and it's one I want to come back to. And you essentially, I assume you're meeting with not only one person, you're typically meeting with more than one person. Maybe you're sitting down with the CEO because it's a CIO role they're looking to fill, or a COO and CFO. You're sitting in there in a room with three different people, and it's really obvious to you they have no idea. I mean, they're essentially at odds with one another. I mean, do you take that on? Well, I mean, that's the situation. CFO, CEO, and chief medical officer, and the three of them have completely different priorities for this person. I mean, where do you go? How do you approach that?
It depends on where you are in the process, but I think it's listening. Again, what are you trying to accomplish with this position? What are you looking for this individual? How are you going to judge success? A lot of times, some of the key buzzwords and the verbiage gets in the way. But when you listen and talk about the expectations and success criteria, a lot of times those are the same. And if you get those and get them prioritizing, what's most important? What are you looking for this individual to do first? If you want to go the digital route, but you have a lack of IT maturity, you have infrastructure debt, how are you going to do digital while you're doing that? And talking about how much money they have to spend, where they want to put it. I think a lot of times you get that resolved very quickly.
I assume a lot of times when you go in there, just like any other CIO role, there's probably 75 to 150 projects going on. Do you try to evaluate where all the projects are at, or do you just try to identify the troubled ones and get those back in line and that kind of stuff? How do you do that? Because 150 projects is not uncommon.
Not uncommon. And I have to take a look across the board to see how we're doing. Because if it's not a trouble area and we're delivering on time and on budget, and it's a well-managed project organization, we're in great shape. If it turns out that it's a situation where we're overcommitted and we're underperforming, then we have to take a look at, all right, what are the priorities from a value standpoint? And we have to start to have the difficult conversations around how things may need to get slowed or tabled for a while so that we can get caught up on the higher value projects. Difficult work to do, more difficult conversations to have, but in the overall greater interest of the organization, it's just something that has to be done.
Are there decisions that you don't make because you're interim that maybe you just take to the leadership team and say, look, here's what's going on. I need to lay this out for you guys?
So the answer to that is yes. And typically when it comes to specific vendor contracting, specific human capital decisions, be it hire, firing, salary adjustment, market adjustment, and then certain project prioritization, because you tend to run into some sticky wickets when you have C-suite pet projects that you don't want to step on a landmine. So you just, again, it then becomes a collaborative, consensus-driven conversation as opposed to going in and saying start, stop, continue. You try to have the proverbial meeting before the meeting to get a sense of what can move and what can't.
Judy, what does compensation look like for this? I was kind of surprised in the article I was reading the other day that the CIO salaries have, well, I'm not surprised that they've increased. I'm just surprised at how much they've increased. Is the interim considered like you just take what a normal CIO would make, divide it by number of hours, and you're getting paid on an hourly, or are they more, is there a different calculus or math to what an interim would make in this role?
I think it's all over the place as far as that goes. But I think it is looking at what the typical compensation would be based for an individual in that role, looking at that, knowing that depending if they're with a consulting firm and they have benefits or they don't, a lot of that goes into the play. But I think right around the salary that the CIO would be paid for that position is how hourly works. And a lot of times it's not hourly, but it's monthly or weekly so that you're not constantly looking at how many hours. Because an interim CIO job, Chris, you'll probably agree with me, is likely more than 40 hours a week.
I would say invariably it's more than 30 hours a week.
Well, to a certain extent, I wouldn't take it. If let's assume the base salary, just for ease, is $500,000 a year, and they said, "All right, we're going to divide that by 2080, and we're going to get the hourly rate, and that's what it is." And you, whatever, and let's just keep benefits to the side for a second. I wouldn't take it, and I wouldn't take it, Chris, because of my consulting background. I would look at that and say, "Okay, you don't understand how the world works. And essentially, I have to find a job before and I have to find a job after. That's a whole bunch of hours I'm not getting paid for. And as a consultant, I have to take those downtime hours into account for my hourly rate." Now, I don't know, maybe my approach is wrong. I'm curious, Chris, what your thought is on compensation there.
So I think as a baseline, I think Judy has it pretty much nailed down. You take the comp of the existing or the recently departed or the one that is being recruited for, use that as the baseline. And then sometimes add in a factor to accommodate the search before, the search after. And then also typically if you're going in as a resource that doesn't have benefits, there's usually a compensation adjustment for that also. So you can increase the monthly rate to compensate for the search time before and after for your next engagement. And then if you have to provide your own benefits because you're not part of an organization that provides them, where you're not a W-2 per se on an engagement basis, you can compensate yourself for that as well.
I think a lot depends on how much you're doing remotely versus being on site. Obviously, if they want you on site, every week, it's going to be more than if they're saying you can dial in some, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the trend is now there's a little bit more tolerance for some remote work, but I can share with you firsthand that the most effective work is delivered on site because again, it's very challenging to build relationships via Zoom, via Teams. It's much easier to develop those durable relationships when you're sitting down the hall from the CFO, the COO, the CMO to set some objectives and accomplish some deliverables and get the work done.
I'm going to change the conversation a little bit to the full-time role that follows. Your last engagement is a great example, Chris, because you left that interim role and they hired somebody internally. And I want to put us in the position of people who want the full-time role. So let's start with that interim staff. How can that interim staff prepare themselves to be considered for that role? Or what can they do to be considered for that role? Judy, I'll start with you because you talk to a lot of candidates who are like, "I'm ready for a CIO role." And you're sitting there shaking your head going, "No, you're not." But on other cases, you're sitting there going, yeah, you're encouraging people. It's like, "Hey, step up. I think you have enough to actually do this role." What could a person who's sitting in the chair right now do to position themselves well for the full-time CIO role?
I think the best thing they can do is talk to some of the key stakeholders and say, what am I doing well? What would you like to see me do? What is an IT doing? And get a feel there for what's going on, and because perception is everything. So if they know how other people see them versus how they think they see themselves, I think that's important. I think it's also important if there's an interim to talk to that interim and say, what can I be doing? Can you help mentor me for this? I think that's absolutely key as well. Because if an interim is coming from the outside, they're not likely to be interested in that position because they're an interim. So they're very willing to help mentor and grow that person, introduce them to people they may not have had a lot of dialogue with over the time. So I think that's absolutely key.
A little bit on topic, a little bit off topic. We're going to close with this. I'm putting you on the search committee. You were on the search committee, Chris, and I can honestly say I've never been on a search committee for a CIO candidate. Not that it would be, I don't know if fun's the right word, but I think it would be fun. But I'd like for the three of us to bat this around. I'm going to throw myself into this conversation as well. What are you looking for in a CIO today? Let's call it a $5 billion regional health system, 7 hospitals, and I don't know, 35,000 employees kind of thing. I don't know if those numbers work, but somewhere around there. You're looking for a CIO. What would you like to see in your CIO candidate today? Judy, I'm going to start with you.
Skill set, education, not that important compared to EQ and SQ. I think that's where the differentiation between the good CIOs and the great CIOs are the ones that have that strong EQ and SQ. They can get out there, they can listen, they can talk beyond bits and bytes and understand the business. To me, those are the most important things. Can they be at the table? And I really thought way back in 2008 and 2009, when we were going through the EHR implementation, that was a time when CIOs would really rise and become part of that inner ELT. It didn't happen quite as much as I thought it did, and it sort of backed off for a while. I think it's coming back now with digital, but I think being that business leader is absolutely what's most important. The rest they can learn.
So is an MBA pretty important? Is really understanding how that business operates, a background in healthcare, understanding how a healthcare organization operates and functions?
A lot of times master's degrees are required. So I think that is important, understanding that and learning to think beyond technology to what are the outcomes that the organization is trying to get to. And especially in this time where most organizations are looking at every penny they're spending.
That is truth. Chris, what do you want to see in the next CIO of our organization?
You have to meet your C-suite partners where they are, have the conversations in the language that they understand, and be able to formulate the technology strategies to get the business and clinical strategies to where they need and want to be. We used to use an expression in one of my former shops in terms of hockey. It was a hockey metaphor, and that's skating to where the puck's going to be. And it was true then, it's still true today. So again, it's understanding the business enterprise, the clinical enterprise, the administrative enterprise, and being able to apply the appropriate technologies to get there. Being out there on the leading edge of some of the technologies, but understanding the application for the particular organization. And then again, being able to, not just at the C-suite level, but being able to have it make sense for the board that sometimes doesn't even know much about healthcare, never mind technology, particularly if it's a community-based board.
I agree with those things 1,000%. And this is absolutely my bias, but we have too many technology empty suits in CIO roles. And I think they need to have a technology background. That's what the organization needs most from them, is an understanding of how cybersecurity works, how the technology works, how architecture works. And it's why we end up with so much bad architecture in healthcare. It's why we end up with so much tech debt. It's why we end up with, because we hire for the leadership aspects of it and not necessarily the business aspects, but the leadership aspects of it. And it's like hiring a CFO because they're a great leader, but they don't know how to do the books. Like you would never do that. You wouldn't even consider that.
Right.
On the technical side, we do consider it's like, oh, well, we're going to put a physician in this CIO role who has absolutely no technical background whatsoever, except they're interested in technology or they're that kind of stuff. And I just think it creates problems. This is me just stirring the pot a little bit, but that's
I agree.
Again, that's probably my bias because I come from a technical background. And I see when the organization has the CIO in the room, 80% of the time, they're not looking for their business acumen. They're looking for them to weigh in on the technology aspects. How is technology going to impact our clinically integrated network? How is it going to impact our acquisition of this? What are the things we should be thinking of? Not that you can't pick those things up over time, because clearly there are a lot of great CIO physicians in the role, but it is one of the primary characteristics.
I think, Bill, to your point, if you're going to hire somebody who is not a technologist, you need to make sure you have a very strong leadership team under that person that is strong in technology.
Yeah.
And can do the work. But if you don't have that depth beneath you, then there may be some issues.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, on the search committee, who's assessing that? We see these search committees all the time, and I've interviewed in search committees, and I thought, who's going to assess my technical capabilities in this room? And the answer was no one. And I think they were hoping that the placement firm was evaluating that, but I didn't feel like the placement firms were evaluating that either, which is really interesting. That's why I just think there's a huge gap there. And we hire based on, wow, that person interviewed well. I really like that person. Yeah, they're gonna fit well with our leadership team, and there's a good cultural fit. But anyway, that's me just stirring the pot at the end. Judy, I want to thank you, and Chris, I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing your experience in this space. With the musical chairs going on right now, this is only going to continue, I have a feeling, and there's going to be more interim roles and more permanent roles being filled. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's keynote. If you found value, share it with a peer. It's a great chance to discuss and in some cases start a mentoring relationship. One way you can support the show is to subscribe and leave us a rating. Love it if you could do that. Thanks for listening. That's all for now.